The soup had gone cold before anyone noticed that Colonel Ashworth had stopped breathing. And it was not the doctor who first understood why. It was the small, white-haired lady at the far end of the table, who had not touched her soup at all. Welcome to Mystery Stories, where every shadow hides a secret, and every cup of tea may be your last. Settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let the story begin. Chapter 1. The Village of Whitmore Ash. Whitmore Ash was the sort of village that appeared on no map of any particular importance, and was rather proud of the fact. It sat in a fold of the Oxfordshire hills the way a cat sits in a warm chair, comfortably settled, mildly suspicious of visitors, and with no intention of moving. The high street ran for perhaps a quarter of a mile, took a gentle bend to accommodate the oak tree that had been there considerably longer than the road, and then resolved itself into a lane that led past the church, past the vicarage, past 3 cottages of varying degrees of disrepair, and eventually dissolved into farmland and the particular smell of turned earth that belonged to November. November was the month in question. The hedgerows had gone the color of old rust, and the mornings came late and gray, the light arriving with a kind of reluctance, as though it had somewhere better to be. The churchyard yew cast its shadow across the light gate for most of the afternoon now, and the Whitmore Arms had begun lighting its fire by 3:30. Miss Jane Marple had arrived on a Tuesday, which she later considered significant, not because Tuesday held any particular mystery, but because it was the day the post arrived twice, and Whitmore Ash was the sort of village in which the arrival of post was still treated as an event. She had come to stay with her second cousin Agnes, or rather Agnes Flint, as she had been for the past 30 years, having married a solicitor with a firm jaw and a fondness for rhubarb wine, now deceased. Agnes kept the cottage with lavender sachets in every drawer and a tendency to describe everything as perfectly lovely, which was Agnes's way of indicating that she had not entirely made up her mind. The cottage was perfectly lovely, Miss Marple agreed. 2 stories, a garden that had been brave in summer and was now retreating gracefully, and a kitchen that smelled of cloves. She unpacked her cardigan, her knitting, her small notebook with the blue cover, and her reading spectacles, and considered herself at home. Agnes, pouring tea, said, "I'm so pleased you could come, Jane. It's been rather a strange few weeks." She said it lightly. The way one mentions a slightly chilly drought before mentioning the window is actually broken. "Oh?" said Miss Marple. "The Ashworths," Agnes said, setting down the teapot with a small, decisive click. "You'll hear about them soon enough. Everyone does." She paused. "They're having a dinner party on Saturday, and rather unexpectedly, we've been invited." Miss Marple added milk to her tea and said nothing for a moment. Outside, a robin was sitting on the garden gate, perfectly still, as though listening. "And this is strange?" she asked. "The Ashworths," said Agnes carefully, "don't usually invite people like us." Which was, Miss Marple reflected, not quite an answer. But it was a beginning. Chapter 2. The Household on the Hill. Ashworth Hall sat at the top of a rise that was too modest to be called a hill, but too definite to be ignored, and looked down upon the village with the expression of a house that had seen rather a lot, and had decided to keep it to itself. It was not grand, exactly, not in the way of the great houses, but it had the solidity of old money, thick walls, tall chimneys, windows that were small where they ought to be large, as though someone long ago had placed them according to plan rather than light. The gravel drive was raked. The yew hedges flanking the gate were clipped to a precision that suggested someone in the household cared enormously about order, or perhaps merely feared what the alternative might look like. Miss Marple learned a great deal about the Ashworths before she ever set foot inside the hall. She learned it from Agnes, certainly, who spoke about Colonel Howard Ashworth with the careful neutrality of a woman who had decided not to have opinions but found them forming anyway. The colonel had retired from the army some 15 years ago, after a career of sufficient distinction to make him a figure in the county, though not quite distinguished enough to make him interesting. He was 62. He had a habit of referring to his own past opinions as the considered view, which Agnes found tiresome. She learned the rest from Mrs. Polly Drummond, who kept the post office and newsagent at the bend in the High Street, and who possessed the particular gift of those who receive things, letters, parcels, newspapers, gossip, of knowing considerably more than she was ever asked. Mrs. Drummond had known Miss Marple was coming 3 days before her arrival, which did not surprise Miss Marple in the least. "The Colonel," said Mrs. Drummond, wrapping a small parcel of shortbread with the contemplative air of someone on the verge of telling you something, "has not been himself lately. Restless. Came in on Monday for his paper and stood for a full 10 minutes looking at the rack without taking anything. Very unlike him. He always takes the telegraph. Has done for years." "And the family?" Miss Marple asked, examining a postcard rack with the mild interest of someone who might, possibly, be thinking of purchasing one. "His wife Margaret. Very quiet woman. Charitable. She runs the church flower rota, though she never quite agrees with what anyone else has chosen." Mrs. Drummond paused to tear off a piece of brown tape. "His son Edward is home from London for a week or two. He works in finance, apparently, though no one in the village quite knows what that means. And then there's Miss Sonia Verne." "Who is Miss Verne?" Miss Marple asked. "That," said Mrs. Drummond, pressing the tape down with more firmness than strictly necessary, "is the question, isn't it?" She said nothing further, which was its own kind of answer. Walking back through the village, Miss Marple noted the church door was ajar despite the cold, and that the light inside had the amber quality of candles rather than electricity. A pair of Wellingtons sat outside the vicarage, one standing, one fallen over. The pub had a hand-written sign offering Scotch broth, today only, which smelled warm and good even from the pavement. Small things. All of them small things. But the small things, Miss Marple had found, were usually where the truth was hiding. Chapter 3. Preparations and Unease. Saturday arrived with the particular crispness of a November morning that has decided to be beautiful about it. The sky a hard pale blue and the frost still white on the north side of the vicarage roof at 10:30. Agnes spent the morning in a state of mild agitation, ironing the same blouse twice and asking Miss Marple whether she thought one ought to bring flowers or wine or neither, and then deciding on a small pot of her preserved plum jam, which was, she felt, both personal and practical. "What do you know of the other guests?" Miss Marple asked from the sitting room, where she was engaged with her knitting with an air of complete serenity. "There are 6 of us going," Agnes said from upstairs, her voice descending through the ceiling with a slightly muffled quality. "The Reverend Featherstone and his wife, you'll like them, they're sensible. And Dr. Hartley, who is a bachelor and slightly deaf in one ear, which he compensates for by listening very intently with the other." A pause. "And then, us. 7 in total, with the Ashworth family." "8, said Miss Marple quietly to herself. She was counting. A dinner of 8. 4 from the family, or perhaps 3 if Miss Verne was not strictly family, and 4 guests. Reverend Featherstone turned out to be a compact, tidy man of about 55, with the benevolent vagueness of a clergyman who has made peace with the fact that most of life's questions remain unanswered, and a wife named Dorothea who remembered everyone's birthday and kept a small notebook in her handbag for the purpose. She had clear, steady eyes and a voice that carried the particular warmth of someone who has spent decades making people feel they matter. Dr. Hartley, who arrived in his own car, was taller than Miss Marple had expected, with a slight stoop and the habit of tilting his right ear toward a speaker, in a way that gave conversations with him an oddly confidential quality, as though he were about to hear something important. They assembled in the lane outside the hall gate at 20 minutes past 7, all of them slightly overdressed for the country, and slightly underdressed for the cold. The hall was lit from inside, its windows throwing warm rectangles onto the gravel, and wood smoke rose from 2 of the chimneys in a way that was genuinely welcoming. Miss Marple looked up at the house. She could not have said precisely what it was, a quality in the light, perhaps, or something in the way the smoke bent in the still air, but she had the distinct and unreasonable impression of a held breath. She adjusted her wrap, smiled at Agnes, and walked up the drive. Chapter 4. The Gathering at Table. Margaret Ashworth met them at the door herself, which was, Miss Marple noted, slightly unusual for a household with staff. She was a woman of 58 or so, carefully dressed in navy wool with a single strand of pearls, the real sort, slightly irregular, which spoke of inheritance rather than purchase. Her hair was silver and pinned with great precision. She smiled with her lips and watched with her eyes, which were gray and intelligent and slightly too attentive to the door behind her guests as she ushered them in, as though she were measuring the gap between outside and inside. The hallway smelled of beeswax polish and chrysanthemums. A great copper bowl of them sat on the hall table, deep orange and rust, and from somewhere at the back of the house came the warm, complicated smell of something long cooked, with undertones of wine and thyme. Colonel Ashworth was in the drawing room. He stood with his back to the fireplace in the manner of men who have spent years accustomed to commanding a room, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he had not drunk from. He was a large man, not fat, but substantial, with a big face and a short gray mustache, and the slightly reddened complexion of someone who spends time outdoors in all weathers out of a sense of duty rather than pleasure. He greeted his guests with a cordiality that was practiced but not warm, shaking hands firmly, making the right noises. His eyes were somewhere else entirely. Edward Ashworth was near the window with a drink, talking to a young woman Miss Marple had not yet been introduced to. He was 30 or so, with his father's frame reduced to something sharper, the kind of man who wore good suits very naturally and who had learned early that confidence was most effective when quiet. He turned and smiled when they entered, a good smile, practiced like his father's, but easier. And then Miss Marple saw Sonia Verne. She was not what Miss Marple had expected, though she could not afterwards have said precisely what she had expected. Something more obviously troublesome, perhaps. Instead, there was a young woman of about 28, dark-haired and composed, dressed in a deep green that suited her, with the kind of stillness that is not shyness, but its opposite, a quality of having decided to observe rather than perform. She was introduced as a family friend, recently returned from several years in Italy. She shook hands with Agnes and the Featherstones and Dr. Hartley with a pleasant, frank attention. When she was introduced to Miss Marple, she paused for just a fraction of a second, the pause of someone recalibrating an assumption, and then smiled, and the smile was entirely genuine. "Miss Marple," she said, "Agnes has spoken of you." "Has she?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I do hope she was kind." "She said you were very observant," said Sonia. It was offered lightly, but her eyes were not light. "At my age," said Miss Marple, accepting a glass of sherry from a young man who had appeared silently with a tray, "there is little else left to be." She sipped her sherry. It was good, dry, with the faint, salty warmth of something Spanish. The colonel had taste in wine, if not in conversation. She looked around the room. 7 people in a warm room. A fire. Good sherry. Chrysanthemums. Everything as it should be. And yet, the colonel had not drunk his whiskey. Mrs. Ashworth kept glancing at the clock. Edward stood with his back to Sonia Verne in a way that was almost certainly deliberate, and Sonia Verne herself, Miss Marple noticed, had taken a seat beside the fire that gave her a clear view of both the door and the window. Small things. Chapter 5. Soup, and what was said over it. The dining room was long and paneled in dark wood that drank the candlelight and gave it back slowly, amber and warm. The table had been laid with the particular precision of a woman who considers a crooked fork a moral failing, 6 candles down the center, the good china with the blue border, wine glasses that had been polished to transparency. The soup was a pale velvet affair, parsnip and something else, a whisper of nutmeg, and was brought in by Mrs. Fleet, who was introduced as the colonel's housekeeper and who moved with the expression of a woman accustomed to knowing more than she was expected to know. Miss Marple was seated at the far end of the table, between Dr. Hartley and Reverend Featherstone, which placed her at a slight remove from the main currents of conversation, but gave her an excellent view of the table as a whole. She was quite accustomed to this arrangement. People tended to place elderly ladies where they could be seen to have been included without being required to affect the proceedings. It suited her perfectly. The colonel sat at the head, Margaret at the foot. Edward was beside Sonia Verne on the left side, Agnes and Dorothea Featherstone on the right, with the Reverend tucked between. Conversation in the early part of dinner followed the usual channels: the weather, the state of the roads, a planning application that had divided the village into two factions, the question of whether the Women's Institute should change its annual quiz night from Thursday to Wednesday, which had apparently been a matter of considerable heat. Reverend Featherstone held a pleasant view on most things and expressed it in a way that managed to sound like agreement without quite committing. Dr. Hartley said little, but listened with the tilted ear attentiveness that made everything sound slightly more significant than it was. Agnes managed her soup beautifully and said something gracious about the room. The colonel said almost nothing at all. He ate his soup. He refilled his wine without offering to refill anyone else's, which was unusual enough that Dorothea Featherstone glanced at Margaret Ashworth, who gave the very slight smile of a woman who has decided this is not the evening to correct her husband. Edward, across the table, was saying something about property values in the Cotswolds, the kind of conversation that fills time without occupying anyone, and doing it with a pleasant ease, but Miss Marple noticed that his right hand, under the table, had curled into a fist against his knee. And then the colonel spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, in the abrupt, declarative way of a man who means to be listened to, about the question of truth. A very small silence fell over the table. The candle flame stood perfectly still. "Truth," said Reverend Featherstone, who was professionally obliged to have views on this subject. "Whether it's better," said the colonel, "to know a thing, or to go on not knowing it, for the sake of peace." He looked at his soup. "I have always believed a man is better off knowing." Nobody answered this immediately. "I think," said Sonia Verne from across the table, in a voice that was perfectly even, "that it depends considerably on what one intends to do with the knowledge." The colonel looked at her then, just briefly. And Miss Marple, watching, thought, "There it is. Whatever the matter is, there it is, between those two." She touched her soup spoon to her lips and said nothing at all. Chapter 6. The course that was not finished. The soup was removed, and the fish course arrived, a sole and a lemon and caper butter, arranged on the plate with the care of someone who has been asked to present something beautiful in a room where beauty is trying quite hard to exist alongside. Tension. Mrs. Fleet served it without expression. The colonel had returned to silence. The wine had been poured again. Outside, a wind had come up from the north and could be heard making its way through the yew hedge at the front of the property. A low, patient sound, like the house breathing. It was Agnes who introduced the subject of Colonel Ashworth's work, his memoir, as Agnes had somehow learned about it from Mrs. Drummond, who had heard from the postman, who had delivered several boxes of papers from a solicitor in Oxford. "I understand you're writing something about your years in service," Agnes said warmly, because Agnes always began from warmth and found her way from there. How fascinating that must be. The colonel looked up. For the first time all evening, something shifted behind his eyes, a brief animation, almost immediately suppressed. "A personal account," he said. "For the family, mainly. The early years, the campaigns. Malaya, Cyprus." He paused. "A record of the considered view, as it were." There was that phrase again. Miss Marple noted it. "It can be very freeing," said Dorothea Featherstone, who had clearly decided that the evening needed assistance, "to write things down, to set the record straight." "Yes," said the colonel. "Quite." Edward had stopped eating. He was holding his fork, but the fork was not moving. and he was looking at his plate with the focused attention of a man who needs something to look at that is not another person. Sonia Verne said, still in that same level voice, "The difficulty with a personal account, I imagine, is knowing which parts of the truth are really yours to tell." She lifted her wineglass but didn't drink from it. Some truths belong to other people. Setting them straight, even with the best intentions, can have consequences. "Consequences are the business of those who have made certain choices," said the Colonel, with a flatness that was not quite controlled. A slightly longer silence. Reverend Featherstone said, very gently, "And how is the garden, Margaret?" which was the conversational equivalent of opening a window in a room where the air has grown close. Margaret Ashworth smiled at him with the gratitude of a woman who has been handed a rope. The garden, she said, had done remarkably well with the dahlias this year. The fish was eaten, or most of it. The Colonel left half of his. He refilled his own wineglass and then set the bottle down rather harder than was necessary. Dr. Hartley, tilting his good ear toward the table, said quietly to Miss Marple, "There is something the matter with Ashworth this evening." "Yes," she said. "I think there is." Chapter 7. After the roast. The main course was a roast leg of lamb, the kind of lamb that has been slow cooking since morning, collapsing tenderly into itself, with a surrounding of roasted root vegetables that had caught at the edges and gone beautifully caramelized, and a dark, serious gravy. That suggested a stock pot given a great deal of time and attention. It should have been a happy course. It was the kind of food that encourages warmth and ease, that makes people lean back and reach for bread, and generally become more generous to one another. The lamb was magnificent. No one seemed to notice. The Colonel ate, at least. He ate with the methodical application of a man performing a duty, cutting his meat into uniform pieces and consuming them at regular intervals. The wine continued to disappear. He was, Miss Marple estimated, on his fourth glass, and his face had taken on the slightly heightened color that wine gives a man who has something pressing on his mind. The conversation had settled into separate streams, Agnes and Dorothea discussing a cousin of Agnes's who had moved to New Zealand under various difficult circumstances, Reverend Featherstone and Dr. Hartley exchanging views on the new bypass proposal, which the doctor opposed on grounds of noise, and the vicar on grounds he could not entirely articulate but felt rather strongly about. Miss Marple talked about her knitting. She talked about it at some length, with particular reference to a pattern she had been attempting for a grandniece, which involved an unusually complicated cable stitch and had required her to begin again twice. It was not, perhaps, riveting material, but it allowed her to watch without appearing to watch, and it occasionally attracted the confiding conversation of people who, finding themselves slightly bored, say things they might otherwise think better of. It was during a lull, while the plates were being cleared, that Edward Ashworth excused himself. He said it was to wash his hands. He said it the way people say things that are true, but not quite the whole truth. He was gone for some 7 minutes. Miss Marple knew, because she was counting stitches, and the rhythm of her counting was steady and regular. When he returned, he was rather paler than he had left, and he settled himself with care and reached for his wine with a hand that was not quite steady. His mother watched him from the foot of the table. Her face said nothing. It was the particular blankness of a woman who has learned, over decades, to keep her face from saying things. The pudding was a warm treacle tart with cream. It was, again, very good indeed. The Colonel was the first to stop eating. He set down his spoon with some deliberateness, looked down the length of the table, and said, apparently to no one, and yet to all of them, "I have decided to tell the truth, whatever it costs. I hope everyone at this table understands that I have been a man of my word." He looked tired, more than anything, and very determined. Nobody spoke. Then Sonia Verne said, quietly but with a precision that cut through the warmth of the room like something cold, "I think, Colonel, that perhaps this is not the moment. On the contrary," he said, "I think it may be the only moment I have." And then he stopped speaking. Not in the manner of a man who has decided to say no more, but in the manner of a man who has suddenly found that he cannot. Chapter 8. The silence at the end of the table. It was Dr. Hartley who moved first. He was on his feet before most of the table had fully understood what was happening. The colonel's head had drooped forward, his chin toward his chest, not violently, not dramatically, but with the terrible quietness of something that cannot be recalled. His wine glass was still upright. His napkin was still in his lap. Dr. Hartley was beside him in 4 seconds, a hand to his neck, and then he looked up at the table with the expression of a doctor who has been in this situation before and has learned to make his face be useful. "Someone ring for an ambulance," he said. "Now. Please." Margaret Ashworth was on her feet. She did not cry out. She moved to her husband's side and stood there very straight, her hand on his shoulder, and if her face had been expressionless before, it was quite still now, a stillness that was doing enormous work. Edward had knocked his chair back and was already in the corridor, presumably for the telephone. Agnes had gone quite white and gripped Dorothea Featherstone's wrist. Reverend Featherstone had bowed his head, which was the right thing to do, and he knew it. Sonia Verne had not moved. She sat in her chair with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the colonel, and her face bore an expression that Miss Marple found very difficult to read. Not shock, not grief, not guilt exactly, but something composed of all three in proportions that did not quite resolve into any of them. Miss Marple herself sat very quietly. She looked at the table. The soup had gone cold hours ago, of course, but the treacle tart sat half-eaten. The wine glasses were at various stages. The candles had burned a third of the way down. Everything was exactly as it had been, except that the thing that had been building all evening, the held breath, the unspoken, the whatever it was that had sat at the table with them since the soup, had finally arrived at its conclusion. She looked at the wine bottle nearest the colonel. She looked at his glass, which was nearly empty. She looked at his plate, from which a small piece of lamb and some roasted carrot remained, untouched for perhaps the last 20 minutes. And she looked very carefully at the pudding bowls, specifically at the cream jug that sat between the colonel's place and that of. She thought for a moment, yes, that of Edward Ashworth. The cream jug was almost empty. It had been full when it arrived. The colonel had not had cream. Miss Marple said nothing. She folded her hands in her lap and waited for the ambulance. Chapter 9. What the Doctor Observed. The ambulance came from Chipping Norton, which was 12 miles away on roads that were dark and narrow and not designed with urgency in mind, and it arrived in 19 minutes, which was, the crew said, quite good. By then the colonel was breathing, shallow and irregular, but breathing, and Dr. Hartley had done what he could, which was steady and competent and left no room for panic. The dining room had been reorganized in the interim. The colonel in his chair reclined as far as it would go, with Hartley crouching beside him. Margaret standing, still straight, still not crying, the rest of the party gathered in the doorway or arranged uselessly around the room's edges in the manner of people who want to help and cannot. When the paramedics arrived, they moved with the brisk, sensible authority of people who have agreed with death on the rules of engagement. They were gentle. They were quick. They asked brief questions of Dr. Hartley, who answered them precisely and followed them at a discreet distance as they prepared to move the colonel. In the brief moment when Dr. Hartley stood near Miss Marple, waiting for the stretcher to come through the corridor, he said quietly, just for her, "Cardiac event. Probably. But there's something in his color that I don't quite like." And he was not a man who drank to excess as a rule. This evening, he drank quite considerably. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "He did. I intend to tell the hospital," said Dr. Hartley, "that they might want to do rather more than the usual tests." "I think that would be wise," said Miss Marple. She said it simply. Not with alarm, not with drama, just with the directness of someone who has agreed with your conclusion and wishes you to know it. He looked at her then, properly, both ears available for once. "You have thoughts," he said. It was not a question. "I have observations," said Miss Marple. Thoughts require rather more information than I currently have. She paused. I would very much like to speak with the local police when the right moment arrives. Would you know who to contact? Hartley blinked, then nodded, slowly. Inspector Graham is the man you want. Decent fellow. Listens. Good, said Miss Marple. Listening is the most important thing. The colonel was taken out through the front hall and into the November night, and the sound of the ambulance doors and then the engine, and then the diminishing sound of its passage down the drive left the house in a silence that was very loud indeed. Margaret Ashworth had gone with him. Edward drove behind in his car. The dinner guests were left in the hallway with their coats and Agnes's pot of plum jam and the warm, cold smell of a dinner that had ended before it was finished. Mrs. Fleet stood in the kitchen doorway, watching. Miss Marple looked at her. Mrs. Fleet looked back with the expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this look and who has been carrying something that is too heavy to hold alone for rather too long. Chapter 10. Mrs. Fleet speaks. Miss Marple stayed behind. Agnes, who was the most loyal of women and also, at this particular moment, the most practical, understood this without being told. She helped Dorothea with her coat and said to Miss Marple, very quietly, "Shall I send the Reverend back for you in an hour?" And Miss Marple said, "An hour and a half, I think," which Agnes received without further inquiry, because she knew her cousin. Sonia Verne had left with the others, which Miss Marple had expected. She had left quickly and quietly, and without the particular kind of excessive concern that guilty people sometimes display. She had said goodnight to each person individually, briefly, and her goodnight to Miss Marple had carried that same slight pause from their first meeting, a recalibration. Miss Marple thought she understood Sonia Verne rather better than Sonia Verne might have wished. She found Mrs. Fleet in the kitchen, which was large and warm and smelled of washing-up liquid and cooling fat and the good remnants of the evening's cooking. The housekeeper was standing at the sink with her hands in the water, but not washing anything, looking through the window into the dark garden. "Mrs. Fleet," said Miss Marple, sitting herself at the kitchen table with the comfortable decisiveness of a woman who intends to be there for a while, "I wonder if I might have a cup of tea. It's been rather a long evening." Mrs. Fleet turned. She was a woman of about 60, with a broad, honest face and hands that looked as though they had spent decades being useful. She looked at Miss Marple for a moment with an expression of assessment, the kind that working people have for visitors who may or may not understand what working is. And then she nodded and filled the kettle. They sat with their tea. Mrs. Fleet, after a small hesitation, had poured one for herself, and Miss Marple said nothing for a little while. She looked at her cup, and at the clean lines of the kitchen, and at the calendar on the wall with its photograph of a Cotswold church in autumn. "You've worked for the family a long time," she said eventually. 14 years, said Mrs. Fleet. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Since before the youngest left home. Then you know them well as a housekeeper knows," said Mrs. Fleet carefully, which was its own kind of answer. "Miss Verne," said Miss Marple. "She's been here before?" A pause. "She has. Not recently. There was a period, 4 or 5 years ago, when she was here quite often. She and the Colonel." Mrs. Fleet stopped. Began again. "She worked for him. Research, she called it. For the memoir." Another pause. "There was a disagreement. She left for Italy. I did not expect to see her again. But she came back." "She came back," said Mrs. Fleet 3 weeks ago. "The Colonel invited her. I don't know why. Mrs. Ashworth was—" She stopped. "Not pleased," offered Miss Marple. "Not pleased," agreed Mrs. Fleet. "And Mr. Edward." She looked at her tea. "He and Miss Verne, there is a history there. I don't know what kind of history. But he became very unhappy when she arrived. And very," she searched for the word, "watchful." Miss Marple nodded gently. "The Colonel's memoir," she said. "Do you know what's in it?" "Only what you hear," said Mrs. Fleet. "Only what you can't help but hear. living in a house. She looked at Miss Marple directly for the first time. There was a meeting. Cyprus, 1974. Something that happened that the Colonel has carried for a long time. He told me once, not the details, never the details, that he had made a decision he was not proud of, but had been necessary, and that the time had come to say so in writing. And who would be harmed by that? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Fleet looked at her for a long moment. I've been asking myself that, she said, since Thursday, when the Colonel showed me the first 3 chapters. She reached into her apron pocket and placed on the kitchen table, with the care of someone laying down a weight they have been carrying for days, a small brass key. His study, she said. He told me to keep it safe, in case. Miss Marple looked at the key. In case of what? She asked. He didn't say, said Mrs. Fleet, but he looked the way men look when they know something is coming, and they've decided to meet it standing up. Chapter 11. The Study and Its Secrets. The study was at the back of the house, a small, north-facing room with shelves on 3 walls and a desk under the window that looked onto the dark garden. It smelled of old paper and leather and a faint ghost of pipe tobacco, though Miss Marple suspected no one had smoked in the house for years. Some smells settle in and decide to stay. The desk was tidy. Colonel Ashworth had the tidiness of a military man, everything with its place and reason. A pen stand. A blotter. A stack of folders arranged in order of some system only he had known. On top of the stack was a manila folder with a label that read, in a hand that was a little shakier than it perhaps wished to be, Memoir. Personal. Not for distribution. Miss Marple opened it with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands what she is doing and has decided it is necessary. The memoir was handwritten, in blue ink, on cream paper, 43 pages so far, numbered in the top right corner. The prose was plain and direct, the prose of a man who had never tried to be literary and was better for it. She read quickly, which had been a gift all her life, and with the particular attention of someone reading not for enjoyment, but for the thing hidden in what enjoyment obscures. The early chapters were unremarkable. Family history, school, Sandhurst, early postings, the professional accumulation of a career. Cyprus came in Chapter 9. She read that chapter twice. In the autumn of 1974, Colonel Ashworth, then a major, had been responsible for securing a property in Nicosia following the Turkish advance. In the property they had found, among various documents and effects, a cache of letters that identified a British intelligence officer as having provided information to the wrong side. Information that had contributed, directly, to the deaths of 3 Cypriot civilians and the burning of 2 houses. The intelligence officer's name had been Verne. Commander Robert Verne. Miss Marple sat back in the desk chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Robert Verne. Sonia Verne. A common surname, certainly. But Sonia's introduction had included Italy and research and a history with the Colonel, and now this. She read on. Ashworth's account was frank to the point of pain. He had reported the discovery to his superior. His superior had advised very quietly and very firmly that certain things were better not reported at all, that Commander Verne was well connected, that the war was over and the dead could not be helped and the living had careers ahead of them, that the considered view, and there was that phrase again, in the memoir, in the Colonel's own account of what had been said to him 40 years ago, was that this should be filed away. Ashworth had complied. He had complied for 40 years. And now, in the chapter before her, he had written, I cannot die without saying it. I was wrong to stay silent, and I intend to say so, regardless of whom it hurts, and regardless of what it costs me. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment. Then she looked at the bottom drawer of the desk, which was the only one not entirely closed. It was open, perhaps a quarter of an inch, as though it had been opened recently and shut in haste. She opened it. Empty. But at the back of the drawer, caught on the inner edge of the wood, was a single photograph. Small. Black and white. Two men in uniform, and what appeared to be cypress, dry hills behind them. The Mediterranean glint in the distance. One was a young version of the colonel. The other she did not recognize. But around the wrist of the unrecognized man, half hidden by his sleeve, was a watch with a distinctive oblong face and a particular kind of strap. Unusual. Memorable. She had seen that watch this evening. She was quite certain of it. On the wrist of Edward Ashworth. Chapter 12. A conversation with Inspector Graham. Inspector Graham arrived at 10 past 10 the following morning, which was a Sunday, which he made no comment about, and was exactly as Dr. Hartley had described, decent and a good listener. He was perhaps 45, with a face that had been outdoors a good deal and a way of sitting in a chair that suggested he might be there for some time, and was comfortable with the prospect. He accepted a cup of tea from Agnes with genuine gratitude and declined a biscuit with what appeared to be genuine regret, and he gave Miss Marple his complete attention in a way that she found, on reflection, rather refreshing. Most policemen she had encountered over the years, and there had been more than might have been predicted for a woman of her circumstances, treated her with one of two responses: the indulgence given to a harmless eccentric, or the slow, burning exasperation of people who have been right before, and do not appreciate being told they are wrong again. Inspector Graham did neither. He listened. He made occasional small notes. He asked, when she finished, 3 precise questions. The first: the hospital reports that the colonel's blood work showed elevated levels of digoxin, enough to have caused the cardiac event, particularly in combination with the alcohol. He is stable, but it was a closer thing than it might have appeared. He looked at his notebook. Digoxin is a cardiac medication. The colonel has not prescribed it. No, said Miss Marple. He would not be. It can be extracted, said Graham carefully, from foxglove. Digitalis purpurea, someone with botanical knowledge could, or with pharmaceutical knowledge, said Miss Marple, or with access to medications prescribed to someone else. The second question: the cream jug. He looked at her. You mentioned the cream jug. It was nearly empty when the dinner ended, said Miss Marple. The colonel did not use it. Dr. Hartley used it once. The Reverend, twice. Everyone else used the other jug at the opposite end of the table. The cream jug near the colonel was used almost entirely by Edward Ashworth, said Graham. By Edward Ashworth. And yet the colonel was ill, and Mr. Edward was not. She paused. The cream jug was not the vehicle. I was wrong to fix on it initially. But it told me that someone had thought about where things were placed at the table, the seating arrangement, the proximity of certain vessels to certain people. Graham looked at her for a long moment. The wine, he said. The wine, she agreed. Specifically the bottle that the colonel poured for himself and only himself, repeatedly, throughout the evening. I noticed that no one else drank from that bottle. It would be worth establishing whether that bottle was opened by someone other than the housekeeper, and when, and where it was kept before service. The third question: Miss Verne, or the Verne connection. He said it carefully. The memoir establishes motive, said Miss Marple. The question is not whether Sonia Verne had reason to stop the colonel speaking. The question is whether she had the opportunity, and the knowledge and the disposition to do it this way. And I find myself... She stopped. I find myself uncertain. There is something about Miss Verne that is not what I first thought it was. She looked out of Agnes's sitting room window at the frost-bright garden. The watch in the photograph, she said. That troubles me more than anything else. Chapter 13. Edward in the morning. Inspector Graham spoke to Edward Ashworth that afternoon, at the hall, while his father was still in hospital, and his mother sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Fleet and a great deal of tea and the particular exhausted composure of women who have been strong for a long time. Miss Marple was not present for this conversation. She did not need to be. She had, however, spent the morning in the village. She had spent it at the newsagent, where Mrs. Drummond, without requiring very much encouragement, produced a rich vein of history regarding Commander Robert Verne, accessible, it turned out, because Mrs. Drummond had a sister in Farringdon who had known the family slightly, and because small places remember, and their postmistresses remember most of all. Robert Verne had died in 1991. He had left one daughter, Sonia, and a legacy that was, in the family's telling, of distinguished service, and in less official tellings, of something rather more complicated. There had been an inquest into certain financial matters, nothing proven. But the watch, the distinctive oblong-faced watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, had been given to Robert Verne's oldest and closest friend upon his death. His oldest and closest friend had been Howard Ashworth. Miss Marple sat in the cold sunshine on the bench outside the post office and thought about this for a while. A robin landed on the arm of the bench and regarded her with the bright, impersonal attention of robins. Howard Ashworth and Robert Verne. Friends. The watch passing from one to the other. And now, the watch on Edward's wrist. Inheritance could be a simple thing, of course. A father gives a son a watch. This was entirely ordinary. But the colonel had kept that watch for 30 years, had presumably treasured it. The giving of it to a son at some particular moment might mark something. When had he given it to Edward? And then she thought of something else. She thought of Sonia Verne's face when Edward had entered the room on Saturday evening. She had watched that room very carefully from the beginning, and she was quite sure of what she had seen. Not hostility, not fear, but something complicated. Something that was struggling between those two and a third thing that she could not name. She thought of Edward's 7-minute absence during dinner, his pale face on return, the fist against his knee. She thought of the colonel's declaration, whatever it costs, and of the wine bottle that he had poured for himself and only himself. She thought of a man of 62 who has decided to speak the truth, and of all the people that truth might damage, and of whether any of them might have decided they could not allow it. One of them had certainly decided exactly that. The robin flew away. Miss Marple stood, straightened her back with some care, and walked back through the village toward Agnes's cottage. She had one more conversation to have before she could be certain. Chapter 14. What Sonia Knew. Sonia Verne was staying at the Whitmore Arms, in the larger of the two guest rooms, which had a view of the church and a small writing table by the window that she had been using. She received Miss Marple with the composure that was, by now, familiar, and with the additional quality of someone who has been expecting a visit and has decided that it is better to have it. The room was tidy. A coat over the chair, a paperback face down on the bedside table, a glass of water, a laptop with several documents open. The documents, Miss Marple noted without appearing to note, had the layout of legal letters. "I came back," Sonia said, without preamble, sitting at the writing table while Miss Marple took the small armchair, "because Howard asked me to, and because I felt I owed him the opportunity to say what he wanted to say." She looked at her hands. "My father was not a good man. I have known this for some time. I thought, when Howard told me what he intended to write, and he told me, he was honest with me about all of it, that I was ready for it to be said." "And were you?" asked Miss Marple. "Almost," said Sonia. "But not quite." She was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the church clock began the slow count to 2. "I came because I thought," she said slowly, "that if I were here I might be able to say, to the people whose opinion mattered, that I knew, that I was not my father, that the daughter of the man who did a thing is not responsible for the thing, and is not asking for forgiveness, but would prefer not to be held accountable." She looked at Miss Marple. "Do you understand?" "Perfectly," said Miss Marple. "And then when I arrived," Sonia continued, "I understood something I had not understood before. About Edward." She paused. "He knew. He has known for some years. The colonel told him, I don't know when, I don't know exactly what. But Edward knows about Cyprus. and Edward knows that his father intends to make it public. And he was, frightened. Not for his father, for himself. She said this without heat, without condemnation, but with the flat precision of someone who has examined a fact from several angles and keeps arriving at the same one. Edward works in finance. His firm has government contracts. If it became publicly known that his father had covered up a wartime intelligence failure, the association would be damaging, said Miss Marple. Potentially career-ending, said Sonia. I don't know whether Edward thought that far, or whether he thought at all. But I know that on Saturday evening he was very afraid and very angry, and when he left the table, she stopped. Miss Marple waited. I saw him, she said. From where I was sitting, I could see the doorway. He went to the sideboard in the hall. The wine had been laid out there, the bottles for the evening. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. I could not see his hands. No, said Miss Marple, but I believe Inspector Graham has asked for the bottles to be tested. Sonia looked at her. You knew, she said. You knew last night. I suspected, said Miss Marple gently. Knowing and suspecting are not the same thing. The Colonel is still alive, which is the important matter. And the truth he wished to tell, the truth about your father, it will still be told. A hospital bed does not invalidate a testimony. If anything, she considered, it rather authenticates it. Sonia looked out of the window at the churchyard for a long moment. My father did a terrible thing, she said. I can't undo it. I can only be something other than it. She turned back to Miss Marple. I am glad Howard is alive. Yes, said Miss Marple. I thought you were. Chapter 15. The village settles. Colonel Ashworth came home from hospital on the Wednesday. He was thinner and more slowly made than before, and he walked with a stick for a few days that he shed as soon as he reasonably could. Margaret was beside him on the drive, not holding his arm, but close enough that the possibility was always there, and Mrs. Fleet had made a lamb broth that smelled from the lane, warm and ordinary and restorative. The village, of course, knew everything. Or rather, it knew the version of everything that Mrs. Drummond had assembled from the available evidence, which was close enough to accurate that Miss Marple did not feel compelled to correct it. The Colonel had been taken ill at dinner. There were questions being asked by the police. Edward Ashworth had driven to Oxford on Monday morning and had returned with a solicitor, which was observed and noted by at least 4 people. Sonia Verne had checked out of the Whitmore Arms on Tuesday, quietly, leaving a brief note for Agnes that Agnes described as dignified and sad and really rather kind. Inspector Graham had been back twice. He had not arrested anyone, but he had conducted 3 formal interviews, one of which had required Edward to make a second trip to Oxford. The matter, Graham had explained to Miss Marple with his usual measured courtesy, was proceeding in the way that these matters proceeded, with careful collection of evidence, with laboratory results from the wine bottle that had been retrieved and tested, and with the Colonel's own written account, which he had provided from his hospital bed in a clear hand and with every appearance of relief. Miss Marple sat in Agnes's garden on Thursday afternoon. It was still cold, but the frost had lifted, and the sky had the particular pale, washed quality that sometimes comes at the end of November, thin and bright, and somehow more hopeful than it has any right to be, given the season. She had her knitting and a cup of tea going cold beside her, and the robin was back on the gatepost. Agnes sat beside her with her own tea and said, I keep thinking of that dinner, how it looked, how normal it all was, from the outside. These things usually do, said Miss Marple. How did you know? When did you know? Agnes asked. It was an old question. She had asked it twice, but she always asked it with genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Miss Marple considered. I knew something was wrong before we sat down, she said. The Colonel's manner, his distance from his own dinner. A man who has nothing troubling him is present in a room. He was somewhere else entirely. She set down a stitch, and then the wine. A host who pours only for himself, repeatedly, without appearing to notice. It suggested he was pouring not for pleasure or custom, but from something automatic, as though the wine were already in his hand before he thought about it. "And Edward?" Agnes said. Edward's absence from the table. 7 minutes. Long enough for a particular kind of action, short enough not to be noticed by people who were distracted by the lamb and the conversation. She paused. "And the watch." "The watch told me about the connection to Commander Verne, and once I knew the connection, I knew what the memoir said, and then the motive arranged itself rather naturally." "But why Digoxin?" Agnes asked. "Where would he have got it?" "His mother," said Miss Marple simply. "Margaret Ashworth has a mild cardiac condition. She was prescribed digoxin 2 years ago. The prescription was in the house. Edward had access." Agnes sat with this for a moment. "He didn't want to kill his father," she said. "Did he?" "I don't believe so," said Miss Marple. "I believe he wanted to incapacitate, to stop the evening from reaching its declaration, to buy time, to find some way of persuading his father, or acquiring the manuscript, or both. Whether he understood what the dose might do, in combination with the wine, whether he thought through the consequences, that is a question for him, and for those responsible for his fate." She looked at her knitting. "Most of the time, in my experience, people who do such things have not thought it entirely through. They have thought only of the immediate problem and the immediate solution, and have hoped that the space between intention and consequence would take care of itself." "It rarely does," said Agnes. "It very rarely does," Miss Marple agreed. They sat for a while in the November afternoon, the knitting needles making their small, steady sound, the light declining slowly across the garden wall. "The Colonel's memoir," Agnes said after a while. "Will it be published?" "I believe so," said Miss Marple. The Colonel appeared to think so, the last time Dr. Hartley visited him. He said, and this was reported to me by Hartley, who has a good memory, that he had decided it would be better to have it read than to have it be the thing that killed him, which seemed to me rather wise. "And Sonia Verne?" "She will do something worthwhile," said Miss Marple. "She already is. Those legal letters I saw on her table, she is working with a family in Cyprus. Reparations, of some kind. It is not restitution, exactly. But it is a beginning." She paused. "She is her father's daughter only in the sense that all children are. In every other sense, she appears to have made herself quite deliberately otherwise." Agnes nodded slowly. The light was going. The garden was resolving into its gray, late-afternoon softness, the bare stems of the roses and the empty hydrangeas and the frost-hardened soil all becoming the same gentle color, as though the world were pausing for thought. Church bells began in the tower down the lane. 6 o'clock. The sound moved across the rooftops and through the bare trees, and dissolved into the evening with the comfortable ease of something that had been doing exactly this, at exactly this time, for several hundred years. "I think," said Agnes, standing and collecting the cups, "that we deserve something warm for supper. I have a rather good Stilton, and perhaps a glass of something," said Miss Marple, rising with the careful deliberateness that her years required. "Though I find," she added, "that I shall look rather carefully at any wine poured in a house where I am not acquainted with the family." Agnes laughed, a genuine, startled laugh, the best kind, and held the door open. Miss Marple went inside. The garden stood empty behind them, the last of the day's light retreating from the wall, the robin gone to wherever robins go when the cold comes properly down. The plum jam, still in its pot on Agnes's kitchen shelf, gleamed a very dark red in the lamplight, fruit preserved from summer, sweet and a little tart, keeping well. Small things, Miss Marple thought, hanging up her cardigan. It was always the small things that kept.